Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video where I'm going to be going over a lot of different ways you can fetch data in React. Okay guys, so I'm gonna go over, like I said, all the different ways that you can fetch data in React. If there's a library that I forgot or just another way that I forgot, just let me know in the comments, but I'm gonna go over all the ones that I feel like are the most common and just explain each one of them so that if you're interested in using this method, you'll use it. And this will include a lot of stuff like different famous libraries like React Query and useSWR, but also stuff like the Fetch API, right? Which is actually the first one I'm going to be talking about right now. So actually, just for the Fetch API, I already wrote the code over here, and I will go over how this actually works. For the other ones, I'll write the code as I go, but for this one, I feel like since it is the most basic way to fetch data in React and in JavaScript in general, I just wanted it to already be written, and I'll just go over step by step. So as you can see, we have an application over here, which all it does for now is it just calls this component. And this component, what it's doing is it is fetching data from this API, and this is the API we're going to be using throughout the whole video, right? All the examples will be doing the exact same thing, but the only difference is they will be fetching the data in a different method. This first method is the Fetch API, and we're fetching data from this dog API. And as you can see over here, it just plays this API just gives you a random image of a dog, and we just display it in our screen, right? So how does the Fetch API works? Well, this is the only one actually that works without having to install anything else. So the Fetch API it's built into JavaScript, right? All you have to do is when you have a URL for an API you want to fetch data from, you just write fetch, which is a function. You put the URL to where you want to fetch this data, and then what you'll get back is some sort of data which is structured in a way that is not the way that we want it to be structured. What do I mean by that? Well, when we get data from some sort of API, usually in React and in most front-end applications, you want it to be structured as a JSON, right? So what we usually do with the Fetch API is it returns a promise. So we say that after the promise is resolved and we get the data from the API, we want to transform the data into JSON. So we always do .then and put a callback function that transforms the data into JSON, right? So what do we do after this? Well, after we get the data as a JSON, it will be a promise, right? And we resolve it again by getting the actual data back. Now this over here just represents the data completely resolved and completely structured that this API returns. So all we have to do now is do whatever we want with the data, right? The data will return this thing called message, and this is just a URL to the picture, which is exactly what we're doing. We just set data, which is a state, equal to whatever we get back from the API, and we display the picture, right? Super simple, super easy. Fetch API, you can't go wrong with it. It is the most simple way to fetch data in React, and you can see it works perfectly. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Fetch API. Let's get to the next one, which is using Axios. Okay, everyone. Now let's go over the second method, which is also a very well-known method. I use it a lot of times in my videos. It is really common, and it is by using a library called Axios. So you can see we have the same component built in over here, but the only difference is we haven't made the request yet. When you make a request, usually like this, it will exist inside of a use effect, unless it is a request that is based on an event like a button click. But in our case over here, we'll just leave this empty for now, and let's start by installing the Axios package. So to install this package, all you have to do is either run npm install Axios, or in my case, I'm using Yarn, I can run yarn add Axios. It will start installing the package, and it should go pretty quickly. And now that we have it installed, all we have to do is we just have to import Axios from the Axios library. Then we'll come inside of our use effect, which is where we want to make the request, and we'll say axios.get like this. And over here, we'll just put the URL to our API, right? So I'm going to put the URL to the dog API that I got. But one thing cool about Axios is in order to specify if you're putting a get method or a put method, a post method, or a delete method, whatever HTTP method you want to make, you want to use, you can just specify over here. So we're making a get request, I'll just say get. But if I was making a post request, I could just say .post, right? So I'm specifying I want a get request, and then I'll just say .then because this will return a promise. But differently from fetch, we only need to handle this once because Axios will handle and transform it into JSON internally. So whatever we get from here, which is the response, is already structured in the way that we want. Now the response in Axios, if you want to get the data that the API actually returns, you have to say resp.data. This will represent the data that the API is returning to your front-end application. So if we want to set our data state to represent this, we just have to say set data equal to resp.data. So now all we have to do is we just have to say .message because this is where we access the URL to the picture. And now our data state over here is representing the correct information. If we come over here, you'll see we're seeing a very cute dog and it is completely working. So this is another way to actually fetch data in React by using Axios. It is a very common way and I would recommend you using in some sort of situations. Now let's go into our next one, which is fetching data using useSWR. So now let's talk about using some really cool libraries out there. And the first one is the SWR library. So SWR, it stands for stale while revalidate. It's kind of like a strategy and also a library which allows you to fetch data in a very nice way. I've used SWR a bunch of times in the past. I have a tutorial on SWR since a lot of people were asking because it is really interesting and I feel like it will be very popular, especially with the new version of React because it is very nice to use when you're trying to use the suspense component that is in the new version of React. So I'm going to show you guys how to implement a simple data fetching logic over here. And I will also show you how to use suspense to have a loading screen. So in order to use the SWR library, we have to install it similar to Axios. I'm going to say yarn add SWR and it will start installing it. So what we want to do is we want to come over here to the top of our application and I just want to import the useSWR hook from SWR like you see over here. Now this hook is really cool. It is the basis for making your API request. So in this case, we won't even need a use effect because everything from like the data, the state to the use effect is all built in to the library. So we don't need to create our own state and we don't even need to create our own use effect. It's all built into the library. So what we want to do is we want to say const and then we open and close curly braces and we'll say data equals to useSWR and then we have to pass two things over here. First one is the link to our API, which is this over here, our URL. Then we have to pass some sort of fetcher, which is just a function that will explain how to organize the data when it receives it. Now it's similar to what we do when we use the fetch API. We could use any type of fetcher over here. We could use Axios, we could use the fetch API, which is what we're going to be using, but use the SWR is just a way to handle the data for you and make it really easy and reliable for you to display that data in your UI. It's not making the request for you, it's just handling everything. What's going to make the request for you is the fetch API or whatever API you use to fetch the data. So what I want to do is I want to create this function over here at the top. I'll call it the fetcher and we'll just set it like this. And I would recommend you to go over the docs to understand it fully if you're a little bit confused. But what we're going to say over here is whenever this fetcher, it will grab all the arguments that we pass over here. Then what it's going to return is basically the result of whatever the fetch API fetches from those args. And by the way, the args in this case would be the URL that we put over here. So technically, it's grabbing this URL and it's fetching the data using the fetch API that I explained in the beginning of the video. Then it will grab it and just like we did with the fetch API, it will turn it into JSON. So all we're saying over here is how to fetch the data and how to transform it into JSON. Then we'll just pass it over here like this. But you might be wondering, okay, we had to do all of this stuff that we did with the Fetch API. So why exactly are we using this useSWR hook, and why do we need this if we're already using the Fetch API again? Well, because here comes the best part of this. We didn't have to create a state, and we didn't have to create a use effect. It's all built in. And we can use this data like this, but we obviously, now it's not returning it's returning the whole data. So I have to say data.message. And you can see that if we go over here and we refresh the page, it obviously doesn't work. Now I say obviously because there's one thing we have to handle, and this is important because it is something that it will cause you errors in the future. Initially, this data might not be loaded completely, right? It makes an API request, and although the data comes in really fast because fast internet, it might take a little bit, right? And in that small amount of time that it's fetching the data, this thing is null, which means message doesn't exist inside of that object. So it's giving us an error, and that's why it's not displaying the image. In this case, what we can do is we can put a question mark over here before the dot. This is called optional chaining. I mentioned it in my previous video, so I would recommend you checking it out. But basically it just says that if data is not null, then try to access the message. If it is null, then don't do anything. So what happens now is it works, right? It will show the image, meaning that the useSWR is working. Now, you know something even better than this is the fact that if the data hasn't arrived yet, we might want to know what to show some sort of loading screen in front of the screen, right? And with useSWR, it is super easy to do that. What we do is we come over here, we enable a feature called suspense by setting it equal to true. And then in React itself, there's something called the suspense component. I open over here the app component from this application. Obviously, you can see I'm using the same application to access to do all of this different parts of the tutorial. If you want to check out this whole app by the end, check out the description. The link will be there. But basically, we have the SWR component being called right now, right? And inside of it, we have the useSWR. Now that we enabled suspense, what we can do is we can come over here and wrap this around with a component called suspense from React, from the new version of React. And what happens is if we put a fallback over here, and a fallback is just saying that if any error occurs related to data fetching or something like that in whatever component is inside of this suspense component over here, then render the following. And you can put a loading spinner, you can put whatever you want. I'm going to put an H1 tag saying that the data is loading. So while the data is loading, this is what it should display. And useSWR is really nice because it already has the suspense feature built in. So if you want to be able to use the new suspense component, if you're using useSWR, that will be super easy. So you can see that now, if I come over here and I show this and I refresh the page, it will say loading for a bit because that will show while you're loading the data, right? Which is really cool. It's a really nice way to handle everything. And since it's defaulting to this over here while the data hasn't arrived yet, we don't need this question mark anymore because this will never appear if the data hasn't been received. So that means that now, if I refresh the page, even without the question mark, it works perfectly, right? So this is something really cool. Another cool thing is now you can also get errors, right? So you can error handle using this because you can say something like if error over here, and this error variable comes from useSWR, they will handle everything for you. And you just have to say if error, then return a message saying something like there was an error or something like that. There was an error. So if there is an error, this will be displayed in your screen, and you can even check to see what error occurred if you want to. But yeah, that's something really cool with the useSWR hook. So this was basically it for this part. I would recommend using this library a lot. I really like it. But now let's talk about another super famous library, which is called the React Query Library. Okay, so I left this one to the end because I felt like a lot of you guys would want me to talk about it, and I really like this library. I love it. I use it all the time, and also because it will prompt a conversation that I wanted to have at the end of the video. So what I'm talking about is the React Query Library. So this library is amazing. It has a lot of different functionalities, but similar to the SWR library, it's not actually a library for fetching data. So you might have noticed that in the SWR, we didn't actually fetch the data using anything from SWR. We fetched the data using the fetch API, or we could have done with Axios or whatever, right? We could have used whatever we wanted, whatever way we want to fetch the data. But what happened is, after the data is fetched, SWR would handle it, right? Would do something and would handle the data. So with React Query, it's not that different. But the reason why it is so important is because it's usually the issue is not fetching the data. It's what you do after you get the data back, right? And with React Query, you can do a lot of stuff with it. So one of the things that is most important, in my opinion, is that React Query serves as a really good state management library. Now, I don't mean that you can replace Redux or whatever state management library you currently have in your application by just using React Query. Well, in some cases you can, but it doesn't mean that you have to. Because what happens is, in any React application, there's many different types of states. One of the pieces of information, one of the types of data that you'll have is the data you get from your API, right? The data you fetch. And that's different from a state that just represents, for example, changes in the UI, right? Those are two different things. One depends completely on an API, on fetching the data, on whatever it's going to receive from an external service. And one is completely dependent on the user using the application, on the UI, on what you want the UI to look like. So they're very different. And for that reason, they have different purposes and different ways to being handled. So with managing your states from data, you can do it in a couple different ways. For example, in this simple example I came up over here, where we're trying to fetch the data for the dog in two different components, right? And our goal is to display the same image twice. So similar to if you have a user in an application and you're trying to fetch their age or something like that, right? Obviously the age will maintain the same. So it's the whole idea of whatever I fetch over here, I want to see it twice in two different parts of my application, but I only want to make one request. The reason for that is because since it is the same information, why would I need to make two requests? That's you're making an extra network request, which is something you don't want. Not only that, but if you do it this way, where in each of the components over here, you are fetching the data in the use effect like this, and just doing whatever with it, the data won't come out the same. And you'll see that if I come over here, the two images are not the same because we're making two different network requests. We can check that by coming over here and opening our network tab on the DevTools for Google Chrome, and I'll do another refresh, and you can see it actually gets called 4 times, and I'll explain why. This is just because my application is on strict mode in React 18, so I don't know if I have never mentioned this before. Maybe I'll talk about this in another video, but in React 18, you'll be making a use effect call twice, even though you put just an empty dependency array over here. If you want to change that for some reason, this isn't even the point of the video, but you could just remove strict mode or use your use effects in the way that it should be used. So you'll see that now it's only making 2. This is completely unrelated, but I just wanted to mention that. But you can see it's still making 2 different requests, right? Which is not what we want. And for that reason, it is getting 2 different dogs. Now, if we wanted to get the same dog and only make 1 network request, we could do something like this. Now, what we did is we just pulled back the use effect and the fetch call to the parent component, which is this one over here. And we're just passing the data that we received back as props to both of the components. Now, since it is only one fetch and the data will be the same and we're just passing it through props, it should be the same dog, which as you can see, it is. So we are only making 1 network request and we are fetching the same dog. Now, this is fine in this use case over here because it is fine sometimes to drill information, or we're not even drilling over here. We're just passing data through props, and that's fine. That's not an issue. But like I mentioned in an example where you have a project where you need to get information about a user who is logged in. So you might need the same information in many different parts of your application. So what would you do in that case? Well, you can't just be passing everything through props and putting everything on the topmost level component, right? So one of the solutions to this would be using React Query, and this is just a small part of what React Query can do. With React Query, what we can do is we can install first the library. So I'm going to open this up over here, and I'm just going to say yarn add React query like this. Now, if you're using npm, again, just use npm install React query. Then I want to go to the top level of my components, because similar to using something like a context, you need to wrap around all the components which you want to take use of the state management functionality of React query, so that all the components inside of that wrapper has access to the different fetches that you make throughout your application. So what I'll do is I'll import over here at the top from React query like this, React query, and I'll import the query client provider, this thing over here, right? And I'll also import the query client. So those are two different things. So the query client provider, it will just be a wrapper, like I mentioned. So it would be like any provider using the context API. And I'll just put this around all the different components that I want to have access to, that I want to provide the data. And then I need to pass a client to this. Now the client will be something we instantiate over here. We use the query client library. We can just say something like, I don't know, const client equal to new query client, right? And then we'll just pass this inside of this, and it should be fine. Now, what we can do is we won't be using any states, and we won't be using use effects. React query will handle all of that for us, right? So it already takes away that issue that we have to create our own use effect, or we have to create our own state. React query will do it all for you. Now, let's just ignore this for a bit. I'll just comment it out. And let's go to one of the components which we want the data, like this one over here. Now there won't be props, right? We'll be actually fetching the data on each of them. But to fetch data with React query, it's super simple. I'll just come over here and I'll say import from React query, and I'll import the use query hook, right? This hook is really good. It will be used whenever you need to query any information, and you'll just say something like this: const equals to use query. Then you'll put over here two pieces of information. The first one, it's what is known as a query key, and a query key is just a string that will serve as a unique identifier for this request, and its purpose is mainly used for caching. So in our case, since we're going to make this request, we want to see this data twice. We need to use the same query key twice so that React query knows that we're trying to get the same information. So I'm just going to call something like dog. And if I use this again with the same query key over here, React query will know that we're trying to make the same request. Now, like I said, we still need to fetch the data. So over here is where we put something like this over here, right? The actual fetching of the data. So I can say fetch, and we don't need to set the data, so I'll just do this. And we need to create a function over here, which will return this. So I'll just say this function returns whatever this fetching returns, right? So I'll fetch the data, turn it into JSON, and then return this to React query. Now I can copy and paste this over here because we're also making the same request. One thing I want to point out is I like to actually create functions that represent each request when using React query. So I would create a file over here saying something like, obviously I wouldn't name it fetchers. It would be placed in a better position, but just for the purpose of this video, I'll just create this file and put it over here. And then I would create a function that would be called, for example, getDog. Now this function, all it does is it just returns this over here, this exact thing over here. Now I'll just return this. Actually, I won't even open this up. I'll just say this. It's returning a function that returns this. And I know it looks weird, but I just find it to be easier because now instead of having to write this twice or 3 times or how many times I want to use this, I can just say getDog and import this from the fetchers function. So I'll say import from /, I need to go back twice and say fetchers, and then just import the getDog function. Now I can just use this how many times I want, and it's fine, it's perfect. So now what I want to do is I actually have this two calls for the use query. Now what do I do with it? Well, React Query will handle everything, and it will return a bunch of pieces of information inside of this little object over here. You can see exactly what it returns. I feel like it should show over here. It is in the documentation if you're interested, but there's a lot of stuff you can get. You can get the data that it returns, just like we want, right? So if I save this over here and I put data as well, you'll see that it will work. If I come over here, you'll see it is showing the same dog, which is exactly what we wanted. So data source for that. There's also, like I said, there's this is loading, which is similar to how I mentioned in the SWR part of the video. You can use it to say something like if is loading, then return a little message saying loading, right? I'll say something like h1 loading, and you'll see that while it's loading for one of them, it'll say loading, right? And there's also the error. You can get a lot of stuff. You see, just for erroring, you can get so many pieces of information, and it's really nice. It's really good. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about is the fact that now it is only making one network request. If I come to the network tab over here and I search filtering just for this kind of request, you'll see it's just making one, but it's getting two images, right? It's although it's being fetched twice in the sense that I'm calling the use query twice, it recognizes that it has the same unique identifier and it will only make the request once. Now, similar to the useSWR hook, I mentioned that this over here is there's something interesting with this, because this is only working for one of them, right? But if I were to put this over here, grab the is loading boolean from here as well, you'll see it will show twice, right? And that's bad. It will show twice because I'm doing it twice, right? So how do I fix this? Similar to the useSWR hook, we can actually configure this to have suspense enabled, which is really cool. All the configuration you can do is over here by just saying something like default options, and you can pass an object. And one of the options is queries, which when you're specifying the different options or different configurations that you want for your queries, you can specify that suspense is equal to true, which, similar to the SWR library, now means that instead of checking this, putting a fallback individually, you can just use the new suspense like component from React. So I'll just import suspense from here, and I'll delete this as well, and I'll just wrap both of this with the suspense hook or the suspense component, and I'll put this like this, and then I'll put a fallback over here, which is the same loading thing, by putting an h1 and saying loading. Now if I save this, you'll see instead of saying two, it will only show once, which is good. It's good for UI development. I really wanted to show this because it is a new feature. Technically, it's only been released for React 18, but I just wanted to show because it's really nice. And this is basically it for React Query. Obviously, there's much more to all of those libraries, right? There's way more that I could have spent a lot of time talking here, but I just wanted to introduce all the different ways that I feel are the most popular. Obviously, I left a bunch of them out, right? But I chose to just show those four because those four are the most commonly known, and also because I wanted to prompt up the conversation that a lot of people, 95% of people, fetch data wrong in React. Not just fetching data wrong, but also handle the data they fetched wrong. And this is a very common disease in the sense in the React community. This whole fight between which library you use is not important, because every library suffers from their developers not actually using React correctly. I'm not saying that I follow best practices all the time. I'm just saying that if you're obsessed with trying to make your website as best as you can, trying to write the best code in React possible, you will end up having a pretty good solution for whatever problem you have in React. And with data fetching, a lot of people ignore issues like fetching the data twice, or making your component re-render unnecessarily, or writing code that doesn't make any sense. So in my opinion, going over and understanding all the different libraries or all the different methods you can use to do such a crucial part of any web application, which is fetching data, is really important, and I would recommend. I only showed the four most popular ones because they are the ones that are going to cause the most impact. If you don't spend time learning each of them or understanding the different ways, I don't feel like you'll have the correct knowledge to choose the method that fits well with you. So if you're looking for me to choose which way is the best one, which way is the best practice, I won't, because there's no best practice. You should look at every library as if it is a company you're investing. You should look at how many people are maintaining the library. You should really look at what the React query team is doing or what the SWR team is doing, because if you start an application using one of those methods, it is really hard for you to transition. It'll take a lot of time. So that's something I wanted to say. Now, I'll say that I've used every single method that I mentioned in this video, and I like all of them. Obviously, some are better than the others, but I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting twice a week and I would massively appreciate it. If you want to help support the channel, just let me know in the comments. Leave a like. If you want to help support the channel, I have a Discord group. If you want to ask questions there, you can go ahead. I'm trying to grow my community and I would really appreciate the support. So with that in mind, I see you guys next time.